Hello and welcome to MacGuffinPodcast.com. Yet another top 5. I'm John.
I'm Ben.
And this time we're going to be talking about our top 5 horror directors. It's a genre that's near and dear to my heart.
Very near and dear to my heart as well.
So let's get this party started. Who are you picking for number 5, Ben?
All right. Well, actually, I have 2 people down for my number 5.
You horrible cheater.
I know it's a horrible thing, but it's a tie, and I do feel that there maybe I don't know. Anyways, to get down to it, the 2 people for my number 5 is Tobe Hooper and Terence Fisher. Tobe Hooper we know as American director who's done such films as Poltergeist and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. One of my favorite films of his is a lesser-known one, Life Force, and that actually leads me into the Terence Fisher pick because Life Force of all his films is, to me, an homage to the Hammer horror movie, and especially when in contrast to Quatermass and The Pit, it's very similar to that, but it definitely plays out. It has a lot of tropes to it, a lot of situations that are very similar to the Hammer horror movies. And if we're going to talk about Hammer horror, Terence Fisher is the king of Hammer horror movies. Directed the horror, exactly, the horror of Dracula, The Curse of Frankenstein, and my personal favorite of all the Hammer horror movies is The Devil Rides Out, in which the only film Christopher Lee is a good guy.
Wow,
yeah.
Awesome. So my number 5 is a much more recent director, and that is Neil Marshall, the director of Dog Soldiers and The Descent. I think, he only has 4 movies on his filmography, only 2 of them are horror, but they are 2 of the best horror movies ever made. The Descent especially would be in my top 10 horror movies of all time,
I guess. Seen The Descent. I know.
Wow, that is amazing.
I know, and it's totally amazing.
Can we replace you with someone else for this top 5?
Well, I saw Centurion, and I loved the hell out of that movie.
The dude, he's just a great director, whether it's doing the action films he's been doing recently or his early horror stuff. Dog Soldiers was a great action horror hybrid, and The Descent is honestly like one of the freakiest movies I've ever seen. It's so claustrophobic. Even before the monsters, like the big selling point of the movie, show up, it's still one of the scariest things I've ever seen. And so he has a bunch of horror films in the pipeline. Burst 3D's coming out soon, produced by Sam Raimi. Oh, cool. So that should be interesting. And I think he has a long career ahead of him in horror. Right now he seems to be modeling himself on John Carpenter, and I think that's a great person to kind of take your career path.
For sure. Moving on, I guess number 4 is, for me, Lucio Fulci, the Italian horror director who's pretty much known for his zombie movies, George A. Romero kind of knockoff films that actually take zombie films to a whole nother level and then beyond to, use a pun.
Great films like Zombie and The Beyond. That's honestly my favorite out of the Fulcis I've seen, but I need to see a lot more of his filmography.
Yeah, he's got some great films. City of the Living Dead, I think, is one of his finer films. Did a few giallo films. Don't Torture an Ugly Duckling, which is a really kind of it's a fierce movie to watch.
Yeah, I think the DVD cover has a kid dead in a pool. So
floating face down. Yeah. It's not a pleasant film, but it's if you like Lucio Fulci and you're into the Italian horror films,
a lot more stream of consciousness horror, a lot less plot based. They kind of go from gruesome set piece to gruesome set piece, which is the appeal for a lot of people. I mean, there's some great things like spiders eating off people's lips in The Beyond, or acid melting people's face.
He's a lot of eye gouging. He's got a thing for eyes. For some reason, especially in The Beyond.
And we have to throw out Zombie versus Shark.
Yes, and Zombie.
In Zombie. If that appeals to you at all, rent that movie immediately.
Zombie versus Shark. It's totally worth it.
My number 4 is Wes Craven. This is a guy who has had a hit and miss career, but I think his hits are really high. And so things like Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream, New Nightmare I'd put up there with his best. The original Hills Have Eyes. I think those kind of outweigh the fact that he also did shit like The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, and most recently My Soul to Take.
Well, The Hills Have Eyes Part 2, though, to be fair, is pretty much just The Hills Have Eyes Part 1.
Yeah, it's about a
few other scenes.
It's about an hour of Part 1 shown as flashback, pretty much. But yeah, I mean, the guy, it's been hit and miss, but he has made such an impact on the horror genre.
For sure.
He reinvented the slasher movie with Nightmare on Elm Street, and then did it again with Scream, and just the kind of savage cinema in the 70s.
Both times, too.
Yeah, he kind of goes everywhere, does a little bit of everything. You've got some cheesy kind of stuff like Deadly Friend. You've got the more hardcore stuff like Last House on the Left. I think whatever kind of horror you like, Wes Craven has something for you, and we have the same birthday.
For sure. All right, moving on. My number 3 at this point is Mario Bava, another Italian director who's pretty much the godfather of the giallo films,
which led into the slasher films.
Exactly. I mean, he pretty much did things with the slasher films that we ended up seeing in a lot of slasher films in the 80s, like a lot of the Friday the 13th movies. Used a lot of stuff that were in his movies, like Twitch of the Death Nerve.
Yeah, I would say that movie, really, probably that and Psycho are the 2 biggest influences on the modern slasher film.
For sure.
And I just gotta say, I'm so glad you're here because you're representing the world where I pretty much, I have a UK guy, and then after that it gets kind of muddy.
I love the Italian horror film market.
It's definitely
they know how to do genre films really well.
Got the best death scenes also, gotta say.
For sure.
That.
And in his movies, he was a painter originally before he was a director, so his films are vibrant with color.
That's true.
The set pieces are really great, and a lot of the times, he will have painted the matte sets himself, so that's really
true.
Fantastic.
And did a lot of cinematography. So moving on to my number 3, we have David Cronenberg. So actually I am kind of worldly. I go up to Canada.
That is another country.
I think David Cronenberg has made a lot of solid movies. I think that's what makes him such a great horror director, is his consistency. Sure. There are a lot of Wes Craven movies, for an example, that I like more than all Cronenberg films, but he also has those awful ones. Cronenberg, for his entire career, has made solid movies, some great, some just really good. I mean, things like The Fly and Videodrome and even Dead Ringers are some of the best disturbing images I've seen on film.
And they're very creative films, too. They're not atypical horror movies in any way, shape, or form.
He's such an original guy. Even The Fly, a remake, was such an original idea. It was 100% different than the original. All it took was the plot line, dude turns into fly via technology, and everything else about it was different. He made it a tragic love story, rumination on AIDS or seeing a loved one get sick. And the dude has awesome special effects too. So many great gore scenes in The Fly, the Videodrome, all of them. Yeah.
Well, I guess if we're going to continue this conversation on to my number 2, it's David Cronenberg. So.
Great. Let's keep on talking.
Honestly, I think of all... if we're going to continue talking about Cronenberg, I think I should just mention that my favorite is probably Videodrome of all his films.
Great film.
That movie is so far ahead of its time, especially when you watch it now and given the context of where technology is out these days, our interaction with television, with the internet, with technology itself. It's so far ahead of its time. It's kind of mind-blowing in a way.
Yeah, and it also just shows what a great mind he has, because he writes most of his movies. He's also the writer of it.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I think honestly, probably Cronenberg is the smartest of all modern horror directors, or maybe any. Like, the dude is well educated. Every time you see an interview with him or a commentary with him, you're going to learn
he's
a million things that you would never have thought you would learn in a horror DVD or interview.
Indeed.
Moving on to my number 2, a guy who, like Wes Craven, has had kind of an up and down career, but the bigs are really big, and that is John Carpenter.
Excellent.
I love John Carpenter. Halloween and The Thing are 2 of my favorite films of all time.
For sure.
And, he's done those great things in horror, but I think he's all around probably my favorite director, just because in other genres, Big Trouble in Little China, Starman, They Live, Assault on Precinct 13, like, he can dip his hand in anything, and you're going to get a great movie.
He is pretty much the purest genre director, I think, that has been in the last 20 years, probably, at least.
And he's usually, like we said about a lot of these other directors, on the forefront of things. Halloween popularized the slasher film, and then every film in the 80s pretty much was a slasher movie. The Thing, with the makeup effects that we then saw so prevalent in the 80s.
Rob Bottin, he just nails it with that.
And he was 19 when he made those effects, which is insane. But yeah, John Carpenter, he has been out of commission for about 10 years, but The Ward should be coming out hopefully sometime soon. So we can look forward to that.
The trailer was released not too long ago, I believe, online. So
Moving up.
We actually can continue this because
Nice.
we seem to be one right off of each other because John Carpenter is my number one pick.
Very awesome. I got to say, it was honestly
film directors.
It was hard for him not to be my number one. We'll get into why that happened.
He is just so crystal clear, razor sharp when it comes to his directing. The Fog is such a fantastic film, especially when you look at it from his given perspective that he kind of sees it as being a children's film, a children's horror story, and it really actually even becomes more frightening and more messed up when you do look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, that's true.
It carries that atmosphere of like the EC comics that he loves so much. Christine is one that I was going to talk.
Underrated one.
I think that movie is very underrated in the fact that it's almost, I would put that movie as close in a comparison to Kubrick with Carpenter to Kubrick with that film, simply because every shot in that movie is practically perfect. Like there is literally like not one shot in that film that is not lit perfectly, not like, you know, aimed perfectly.
I agree
everything
with you,
is set in
one
that
of the
film.
best directors of all time, horror or otherwise. And so my number one was Alfred Hitchcock, and I think the reason maybe that doesn't appear on some other lists is just because people kind of, you know, it's Hitchcock, of course, let's think of other people who aren't Hitchcock, or he does more suspense than horror. But I mean, honestly, horror as we know it today wouldn't exist without Psycho or The Birds.
I think to a certain degree. I think horror was already existed.
But Psycho brought it to modern day. It wasn't, you know, back in an old castle.
He brought it into a mainstream environment.
And the whole slasher template.
Well, it's slasher films kind of almost been around prior to that. I mean, there was you know, low budget.
I mean, I know what was it? Peeping Tom came out like the same year, but.
Yeah, there was low budget, you know, horror films that were before that were borderline slasher films.
But I mean, the guy's a great director, regardless of whether or not you consider him a horror director or not.
I think is the difference.
And yeah, even if you just think like, oh, the suspense scenes in something like Rear Window or Vertigo are more effective than anything in most modern horror movies. So that's why I got to say, number one horror for John is Alfred Hitchcock. But I can't argue with John Carpenter.
Hey.
So let us know what you think. Hitchcock or these other directors, who did we leave off? There's a lot of people it was hard for me not to include on my list, like Joe Dante or Stuart Gordon. Just so many great directors out there.
Yeah, exactly.
MacGuffinPodcast.com. Sam Raimi. The list could go on and on. MacGuffinPodcast.com is where you can let us know what you think. And we'll see you next time at the Top 5 Corner.
Thanks.